Every August, Scottish football performs the same little ritual. Hope returns. Supporters convince themselves that this might finally be the season something changes. A new manager says all the right things. Someone from Scandinavia arrives with an impressive YouTube compilation. There's an academy player who's apparently the next big thing. Maybe this is the year the title race survives until Easter. Maybe a Scottish club actually enjoys Europe instead of treating it like an expensive short holiday. Then autumn arrives, reality clears its throat, and everyone remembers why they felt like this last August as well. Mind you, that's hardly unique to Scotland. Football supporters aren't renowned for being creatures of cold, rational analysis. If they were, nobody would voluntarily drive 3 hours through horizontal rain to watch Ross County away before spending the journey home arguing about whether the left back just doesn't want it enough. Football has always depended on optimism surviving longer than the evidence. That's part of its charm. So this isn't another gloomy declaration that Scottish football is dying. People have been predicting its demise for decades now, usually while standing in packed stadiums full of supporters making enough noise to register on nearby seismographs. If Scottish football really were on its last legs, nobody seems to have informed the people buying the pies. No, the problem feels subtler than that. Scottish football hasn't lost its passion. If anything, it has more of that than many wealthier leagues could ever hope to manufacture. What it seems to have lost is confidence in what it actually is. Somewhere along the way, it became convinced that success meant looking increasingly like everyone else. We want elite training facilities, data analysts, glossy social media videos filmed at sunrise, and recruitment departments with enough job titles to populate a small council office. At the same time, we cling fiercely to traditions that belong somewhere around 1987, as though football reached its natural peak just before satellite television arrived, and everything since has been an unfortunate misunderstanding. It's an odd combination. Modern football on weekdays, nostalgia at weekends. The whole sport sometimes feels as though it's trying to drive with one foot on the accelerator while keeping the other firmly planted on the handbrake. Eventually, of course, every conversation about Scottish football arrives at Celtic and Rangers. Trying to avoid them would be rather like discussing British politics while politely pretending Westminster doesn't exist. People often speak about breaking the old firm dominance as though it's mainly a question of ambition. If only everyone else recruited a bit better. If only clubs believed in themselves. If only somebody discovered the tactical equivalent of cold fusion. It's an attractive idea because it suggests there's a clever solution waiting to be found. Unfortunately, football has always shown a stubborn refusal to ignore economics. The gap isn't simply about better players, it's about television income, European football, sponsorship, commercial revenue, worldwide fan bases, and decades of accumulated success feeding into one another. Money creates success. Success attracts more money, and eventually the machine becomes remarkably good at maintaining itself. Scottish football spends a great deal of time hoping somebody will interrupt that cycle. Occasionally they do, although it usually requires either extraordinary competence or spectacular self-destruction from one of the giants. Banking on either isn't much of a long-term strategy. Then again, dominance itself isn't uniquely Scottish. Germany had Bayern Munich. Italy spent years revolving around Juventus. France still has Paris Saint-Germain treating League One rather like an administrative exercise before the Champions League begins. The difference is that many of those leagues eventually asked a more useful question. Instead of endlessly debating how to dethrone the biggest club, they focused on how everyone else became stronger. Scottish football often seems more interested in surviving until next May. There's a difference. You see it every few years when somebody unveils another grand proposal for league reconstruction. The presentations are always wonderfully optimistic. New structures, fresh ideas, bold thinking. Then, after several months of meetings, consultations, and committees, everyone somehow arrives at the conclusion that perhaps we should simply play the same teams 5 times instead of 4. It's oddly comforting, Somewhere in Scotland, there's probably a filing cabinet that's convinced it's revolutionising football. Youth development follows a similar pattern. Every club talks enthusiastically about producing the next generation until an academy graduate misplaces two passes on a wet Tuesday night in Motherwell, at which point half the crowd decides he should probably spend the rest of his career on loan in League One, while somebody searches for a 33-year-old journeyman who's been around the game. We love the idea of young players. Actual young players are considerably less popular. It's hardly surprising that so many talented youngsters leave at the first sensible opportunity. Of course, money matters, and Scotland isn't going to outspend England, Germany, or Spain. Complaining about the Premier League's financial advantage is rather like complaining that the North Sea is inconveniently wet, entirely accurate but unlikely to change anyone's plans. The more interesting question is why we spend so much time comparing ourselves with countries we'll never resemble instead of paying closer attention to those we actually could. Look at Norway. Look at Denmark. Even Bodo Glimt, a club from a town inside the Arctic Circle, have shown what can happen when a club commits to a clear identity, develops players sensibly, and accepts that selling talent isn't failure, but part of the business model. Nobody there appears to regard losing a good player as a national tragedy. In Scotland, the phrase selling club can still sound faintly insulting, as though financial sustainability were somehow lacking in ambition. Supporters understandably hate watching their best players leave. Club accountants tend to have a more nuanced view. The awkward truth is that Scottish football probably succeeds by becoming better at producing footballers than keeping them. That's not glamorous, but neither is balancing the books. Besides, every league has to understand what game it can realistically win. Another habit doesn't help either. Every disappointing European campaign becomes evidence that Scottish football is collapsing before our eyes. Then, one impressive result arrives, and suddenly we're announcing a glorious renaissance. We seem constitutionally incapable of accepting that most seasons are, in fact, fairly ordinary. Perhaps we are simply an emotionally exhausting nation, or perhaps football gives us permission to experience every emotion at maximum volume. The reality is much less dramatic. Scottish football isn't broken. It isn't booming either. It's muddling along with extraordinary strengths that it occasionally seems faintly embarrassed by. The atmosphere remains exceptional. The rivalries still matter. Communities genuinely identify with their clubs in a way that billion-pound global brands struggle to recreate however many marketing consultants they employ. You can't manufacture that sort of loyalty with a rebrand or a documentary series, yet we often behave as though authenticity is something to apologise for. Instead of leaning into what makes Scottish football different, we keep trying to sand off the rough edges until we resemble everyone else. That seems backwards. The rough edges are the point, the old stands, the impossible away trips, the arguments over VAR that continue well into the pie queue, the fact that complete strangers can instantly become experts on refereeing law after one disputed penalty. None of it is especially polished. Thank goodness. Football has become increasingly global, which makes the genuinely local parts more valuable, not less. Scottish football has never competed because it was the richest league, or because it offered the world's finest technical football every single weekend. If we're being honest, some matches resemble organised disagreement with a football somewhere in the middle. People still care, properly care. Not because somebody in a marketing department has built fan engagement, but because families have been following the same clubs for generations, often without ever stopping to ask whether it makes much sense. Objectively, it probably doesn't. Then again, neither does supporting any football club. That's rather the point. Scottish football has spent years trying to convince everyone that it belongs in someone else's story. The irony is that its greatest strength has always been its own. It doesn't need to become the Premier League's poorer cousin or a miniature version of Germany or Denmark. It simply needs to make better decisions while remaining unmistakably Scottish. The image will take care of itself after that. Reality usually does.